California, summer of 1989. A young mother kissed her own mother goodbye, buckled two babies into a worn sedan, and drove toward what she thought was freedom. 3 days later, the car was gone. The mother was gone. The babies were gone. No crash site, no witnesses, no answers. What remained was silence, stretching across decades like a scar that refused to heal. This is the story of Rachel Morrison and her 2 infant daughters, a mystery that swallowed 3 lives whole and spit out only questions. It's a story about waiting, about a porch light that burned for 36 years, and about the moment when science finally spoke louder than silence. If you think you know how this ends, you don't. It started like any other morning. The sun climbed over the rooftops of Oxnard, painting the streets gold. Inside a small apartment, the sounds of life hummed softly. A baby cried. Dishes clattered. A young woman moved quickly from room to room, her dark hair pulled back, exhaustion hidden behind a practiced smile. Rachel Morrison was 23. She was a single mother with 2 daughters under 2 years old. Sophie, 14 months, toddled after her with a cracker clutched in one tiny fist. Claire, barely a month old, lay swaddled on the couch, blinking at the morning light. Rachel's mother, Dorothy, sat at the kitchen table, watching her daughter with the quiet worry only mothers understand. Rachel had told her the night before. She wanted to leave for a few days, visit a friend in Arizona, clear her head, get some air. Dorothy frowned at the thought. 2 babies, an old car, a long drive across the desert. It didn't sit right, but she didn't argue. She never did. "That's a long drive, honey," Dorothy said, her voice soft but firm. Rachel smiled, that same smile she'd used since childhood, the one that said, "I know, but I'll be fine." "The car runs," she replied. "We'll stop when they need to eat, just a few days." Dorothy didn't press further. She packed a small basket instead, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of coffee, a blanket for the back seat. She set it by the door and tried not to notice the tiredness in her daughter's eyes. By late morning, everything was ready. Rachel strapped the babies into their car seats, checking the buckles twice. Sophie held her worn rabbit. Claire slept, her tiny fist curled against her cheek. Dorothy walked out to the driveway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Call me when you get there," she said. Rachel leaned out the window and kissed her mother's cheek. "I will, just a few days." The engine coughed to life. Dorothy stood on the curb, watching the car roll away. She could see the outline of the baby seat through the rear window. A small hand pressed against the glass. Then the car turned the corner and disappeared. That was the last time she saw them. The rest of the day passed quietly. Dorothy washed dishes, folded laundry, moved through the house like always. She thought about calling but told herself to wait until evening. The hours ticked by. Afternoon turned to dusk. The kitchen clock grew louder in the silence. By 9 o'clock, Dorothy was pacing. By midnight, she was afraid. She called the number Rachel had given her. No answer. She called again at 2 in the morning. Still nothing. She went outside, stood under the porch light, and stared down the empty street. The night was still. No engine, no voice, nothing. By morning, her worry had hardened into something heavier. She called again, then drove to the gas station down the road. "Have you seen a beige sedan? Young woman? 2 babies?" The man at the counter shook his head. She stopped at the diner near the highway. Same answer. No one had seen them. That evening, the local news aired a brief segment. Authorities are looking into the disappearance of 23-year-old Rachel Morrison and her 2 young daughters. Last seen leaving their home in Oxnard yesterday morning. The screen showed a single photograph. Rachel smiling, Sophie on her lap, Claire in her arms. It lasted only a few seconds. Dorothy didn't move. She just sat there, the glow of the television flickering across her face. In the other room, the high chair waited by the window. A baby bottle sat on the counter. The air smelled faintly of milk and lavender. When the newscast ended, she turned off the television and went to the window. The porch light still burned. She whispered into the dark, "Come home, Rachel. Please, come home." And the world went on. Neighbors left for work. Children walked to school. Cars rolled past the house. Only inside that small apartment did time stop, frozen at the moment when one mother and her 2 daughters drove away and never returned. But if you think that's where the story ends, you're wrong. Because 33 years later, the silence would finally break. In the days that followed, the Morrison family clung to hope like a lifeline. Maybe the car broke down. Maybe the phone lines were cut. Maybe she'd walk through the door any minute, apologizing for the delay. But each sunrise came and went, and the silence only deepened. By the end of the first week, Dorothy stopped pretending. Her daughter and granddaughters were gone, and no one could explain why. She went back to the police station, holding the same photograph she'd shown to half the town. A young woman smiling, 2 babies pressed close. "She wouldn't just leave," Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. The officer nodded, polite but distant. "We'll put out a notice," he said, writing something down. "If anyone reports a sighting, we'll contact you." That was how it began. The long, quiet war against time. Every morning, Dorothy printed more flyers. She and David, her son, drove through neighborhoods, taping them to telephone poles and laundromat walls. Missing, Rachel Morrison and 2 children. The paper curled in the heat. Sometimes the wind tore them loose. David took time off work to drive, the route Rachel was supposed to have taken. He stopped at every rest area, diner, and gas station. "Have you seen this woman?" he'd ask. Most people shook their heads. Some thought they might have. But there were no names, no license plates, no proof. Back home, Dorothy kept a map pinned to the living room wall. Red pushpins marked every report, every rumor, every sliver of hope. The map began to look like a wound, spreading outward from their small town. At night, she'd stand before it with a cup of tea gone cold, tracing the roots with her fingertip. "Somewhere here," she'd whisper. "Somewhere close." Weeks turned into months. The local news covered the story once more, then moved on. Other tragedies took its place. The world was never short of loss. Still, Dorothy refused to stop. She called police stations across state lines. She wrote letters to shelters, hospitals, social workers. Sometimes she received polite replies. More often, there was silence. Once, an officer from Arizona called to say they'd found a vehicle resembling Rachel's. It turned out to be a different make. Another time, someone claimed to have seen a woman and 2 children at a motel near the border. Dorothy drove 6 hours with David. The family at the motel had never heard of them. Every disappointment carved a little deeper. But she never let go. Hope had become a duty. There were nights when the family gathered in silence, eating together without speaking. The high chair still stood by the table. Time went on without permission. Dorothy wondered how old her granddaughters would be, what words they might have learned, what games they would have played. She dreamed of them sometimes. 2 little girls laughing in the backyard, the sound so real that she woke with tears on her pillow. A few months after the disappearance, the investigation began to thin. The detective assigned to the case stopped returning calls. "We followed every lead," he said finally. There's no evidence of foul play, no sign of an accident. We can't track her beyond the California border. In the police report, a phrase appeared for the first time. Presumed voluntary disappearance. To the Morrison family, it felt like betrayal. They knew Rachel. She loved those babies more than her own breath. She wouldn't just vanish. But without proof, the case began to cool. The file moved from one desk to another until it found its way into storage. At home, the map remained on the wall. Dust began to settle on the pins. By the second year, the flyers had faded to near white. Dorothy stopped printing new ones. Instead, she started keeping a small notebook beside her bed. A diary of leads, names, dates, and prayers. She wrote in it every night. Day 147. No call. No word. Day 208. Dreamed of them again. Day 400. Nothing. The human mind has a way of making room for pain. Life continued in its quiet rhythm. Church on Sundays, laundry on Mondays, soup on the stove every night. But beneath it all, the waiting never stopped. On the second anniversary of their disappearance, Dorothy attended evening service at Grace Chapel. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The candles flickered along the pews. The priest spoke of faith, of patience, of trusting in what cannot be seen. But Dorothy's heart was elsewhere. Somewhere along a dusty highway, beside a nameless road where she imagined her daughter's car might still be parked. Door half open, the wind carrying a lullaby into the dark. When the choir began to sing, her resolve finally cracked. She bowed her head. Tears fell silently onto her hands. Under her breath, she whispered a prayer she'd said 1,000 times before, but never quite like this. If I can't bring them home, then please just let me know they're somewhere, that they're not alone. The candles flickered. For a brief moment, she thought she felt warmth brush her cheek, like the touch of a small hand. Then it was gone. Outside, the church bell rang, echoing across the empty streets. The night was cool and still, and in the Morrison home, the map of red pins hung quietly on the wall. Dust gathered at its edges. The porch light still burned, steady and soft, waiting for the sound of an engine that would never come. But what Dorothy didn't know, what no one knew, was that somewhere in the Arizona desert, buried beneath sand and time, a truth was waiting. A truth that would take 33 years to surface. And when it did, it would change everything. Because Rachel Morrison wasn't missing anymore. She was just waiting to be found. Years slipped quietly into decades, each one folding into the next until time itself seemed to lose its edges. The Morrison family grew older. Their faces lined not only by age, but by waiting. The little apartment in Oxnard remained almost exactly as it had been the day Rachel and the girls drove away. The toys still sat in the corner. The high chair still stood by the window. Dorothy dusted the picture frames every Sunday, tracing her daughter's smile with the tip of her finger before whispering a prayer into the still air. Every year on the birthdays of the missing girls, she baked 2 small cakes, one pink, one white. The candles were never lit. They stood untouched, like promises she refused to break. Family members would gather around the table in silence, the room heavy with the sound of absence. Afterward, Dorothy would wrap the cakes carefully and leave them by the window. "In case they find their way home tonight," she'd say. The police file had long been sealed. A single line summed up 36 months of unanswered questions. Presumed dead. Insufficient evidence. The words looked so neat on paper. So final. As if the case could be folded away just like that. But for Dorothy, it was never final. It was a wound that refused to close. From time to time, new whispers drifted through the neighborhood. Some said Rachel had run away with a man. Others claimed she'd sold her babies for money. The stories were cruel, shaped by distance and ignorance. But the family met them with silence. They knew better. Rachel's love for her children was the one thing no rumor could stain. As the years stretched on, the world forgot. New cases replaced the old. New faces appeared on missing posters. The Morrison name faded from the lists, the maps, the headlines. What had once been an urgent mystery became a quiet ghost story, mentioned only in passing. And yet inside that small California home, the porch light still burned each night. It had become more than a habit. It was a language between the living and the lost. A signal that said, "We haven't stopped waiting." For more than 3 decades, the world had learned to live without the name Morrison appearing in its records. The file was closed. The photographs faded. The story of a mother and her 2 missing daughters had dissolved into the haze of half-remembered tragedies. But in 2022, far from California, in a quiet corner of the Arizona desert, that silence began to stir. It started with a project known simply as Jane Doe. The county forensic department had partnered with a national initiative to identify the thousands of unnamed remains buried across the American Southwest, victims of accidents, crimes, or lives forgotten by time. In a small sun-beaten evidence room in Mojave County, a technician opened a box labeled Unidentified Female, 1989. Inside were bones carefully wrapped in plastic, a faded case file, a few scraps of fabric that had once been a dress. The file was thin. Found December 1989. Discovered by hikers near a dry wash. No identification. Cause of death. Multiple stab wounds. For 33 years, the woman had been known only as Jane Doe. Her case, like so many others, had gone nowhere. But technology had changed. A new kind of DNA analysis, more precise, more patient, could read what the old machines could not. The remains were sent to a private lab specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The science of tracing DNA to find living relatives, a swab of bone dust, a few strands of hair. That was all it took to reopen a mystery that had once gone cold under the Arizona sun. Weeks later, the results came back. A hit. Not a name, but a direction. A cluster of genetic links pointing toward a family line in California. The data was entered into a national database, and from there, it found its way to a small aging record under the label Missing Person. Rachel Morrison. Reported 1989. When the call came, the Oxnard Police Department almost didn't know who Rachel Morrison was. The detective assigned to cold cases was new. He'd never even heard the name. He opened the old file and found only a few yellowed pages. A missing person report. A blurry photograph of a young woman holding 2 infants. And a note written decades ago in the corner. Presumed voluntary disappearance. Now, across hundreds of miles and 33 years, science had pulled the threads tight again. The detective drove to the Morrison family's old address, half expecting no one to live there anymore. But when he knocked on the door, Dorothy Morrison, now an old woman with white hair and trembling hands, answered. The house smelled of candles and old wood. On the wall behind her, still hanging where it had always been, was the same photograph. Rachel smiling, her babies in her arms. The colors had faded to sepia, but the faces were clear. The detective introduced himself gently. He explained that he worked with the county task force and that there had been a development. Dorothy stared at him. Quiet and steady. The way people do when they've spent a lifetime preparing for bad news. She invited him in, poured coffee without asking, and waited. "Mrs. Morrison," he began softly, "we believe we found your daughter." Her hand froze halfway to her cup. He told her about the project, about the DNA, about the match. His words were careful, clinical, kind. When he finished, the only sound in the room was the slow ticking of a wall clock. Dorothy closed her eyes. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she whispered, "You mean she's gone?" The detective nodded. There were no screams, no collapse, no dramatic cries, just the quiet sound of a woman breathing through 33 years of waiting. Finally exhaling into the truth. Later, when the family gathered, the detective showed them what little remained of the report: the approximate location in the desert, the estimated time of death, the evidence that had survived. It suggested that Rachel had likely died within days of leaving home. No personal belongings were recovered, no vehicle ever found. The case offered no answers, only confirmation that the waiting was over, and that it had been for decades. David, her brother, stared at the map laid out on the kitchen table. "All this time," he said quietly, "she was right there, just miles from the border." His voice was thick with disbelief, as if he were trying to bridge the impossible gap between past and present. Dorothy said nothing. She went to her room and brought out a small wooden box, one she'd kept on her dresser since the day Rachel vanished. Inside were folded newspaper clippings, photographs, and the last letter her daughter had written, a simple note thanking her for the blanket she'd sent for the baby. Dorothy pressed the letter to her chest and murmured, "At least now I know where she rests." But the news, though it brought closure, opened a deeper wound. Because the file, reborn after decades, still carried one haunting word. Under the line that listed children, the space remained blank, marked only by the word unknown. 2 missing girls, ages 1 month and 14 months. No bodies, no records, no graves. Now, with their mother found dead, the question burned brighter than ever. What happened to the children? The investigators revisited the old case, combing through archives, contacting adoption agencies, hospitals, Child Protective Services records from 1989. But 33 years is a long time. Systems change, files are lost, names are misspelled, people forget. The trail once again began to blur. Still, something about the discovery refused to rest. The forensic team kept digging. They ran the mother's DNA again, this time building a digital profile that could be used to search for related genetic markers in public databases. If the children survived, one analyst said, there's a chance their descendants, or even they themselves, might show up in the system someday. For the Morrison family, hope had always been both a blessing and a curse. Now it flickered again. Small, fragile, almost impossible. Dorothy didn't dare call it hope. Not yet. But she began setting 2 extra plates at the table again, just as she had in the early years. When asked why, she simply said, "Because someone might be coming home." The news of the identification spread quietly through the town. Neighbors brought casseroles, flowers, condolences, unsure what to say. Some called it closure. Others called it tragedy. To Dorothy, it was both. She could finally stop wondering whether her daughter was cold, hungry, or afraid. But the image of those 2 babies, lost somewhere beyond the reach of her arms, remained unbearable. The police promised to reopen the missing children's case, though resources were limited. "It's been too long," the detective admitted, "but if there's a chance, any chance, we'll take it." That night, Dorothy sat by the window, looking out at the porch light that had burned almost every evening since 1989. The bulb had been changed countless times, the lamp rewired, but the ritual never faded. She spoke softly, her voice thin with age. "I kept it on for you, Rachel. I didn't know you'd already gone where I couldn't follow." Her eyes lifted toward the sky, still endless, heavy with the same stars her daughter might have seen on that last night in the desert. Somewhere beyond what could be known, she hoped Rachel could see the light. When the detective left, he paused at the doorway. The house smelled faintly of wax and roses. On the kitchen wall, the old map still hung. Its red pins long since faded. He noticed one new pin, freshly placed, far out east, Arizona. Below it, in Dorothy's delicate handwriting, were 2 words: found, finally. But beside it, under the small space marked children, she had written something else. 3 short letters that said everything that remained unsolved. TBD, to be determined. Because though the file had been reopened and one truth had been unearthed, the heart of the mystery still waited in silence. 2 tiny lives had vanished alongside their mother. And even now, the desert refused to give them back. In the sterile light of the evidence lab, the technician filed away the completed report. The box that once held the Jane Doe remains was sealed. Again. Now labeled with a name. For Rachel Morrison, the search had ended. For her daughters, it had only just begun. And in the small California home, where time had stopped 33 years ago, the porch light still burned against the dark, its glow no longer for the lost mother, but for the 2 children who had never come home. For a long time after Rachel's body was identified, the world seemed to go still again. The headlines faded. The sympathy cards stopped coming. And the family retreated back into their small, quiet home. The tragedy that had once consumed the Morrison name was now just another file, reopened and left unresolved. Yet among the investigators who had worked the Jane Doe project, there lingered one question that refused to rest. What happened to the children? In 2023, the Mojave County Sheriff's Office partnered with a group of forensic genealogists, specialists in a field that blurred the line between science and detective work. They called it forensic genetic genealogy. A new way of listening to what DNA had to say. Sometimes whispers so faint they could only be heard through generations. The process was slow, delicate, uncertain, but for a case like this, it was the only thing left. The idea was simple in theory, but revolutionary in practice. If the daughters of Rachel Morrison were still alive, or if their descendants existed somewhere, their DNA might have entered a public genealogy database, through a medical test, or ancestry kit. All it would take was one match, one shared strand of code to unlock the truth. A detective visited the Morrison family again, this time carrying sterile swabs and consent forms instead of questions. Dorothy, now frail and soft-spoken, agreed without hesitation. "Whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "If there's even a chance they're out there, we owe them that." The samples were taken from the family. David, a niece, a cousin, and sent to a lab in Texas where computers could scan millions of genetic markers. The results would be compared against every known DNA entry in the major genealogy networks. It was a long shot. But for the first time in decades, there was something new to hope for. Weeks turned into months. Then months turned into years. Nothing. The reports came back the same. No significant matches found. Dorothy asked about it less and less as time passed, and when she did, the answers were always careful, technical, empty. "We're still looking, ma'am," they would say. "Sometimes these things take time." By 2024, the case had fallen quiet again. The lead detective retired. Another took his place. The new investigator, Detective Sarah Bennett, was younger. Born after the Morrison girls had vanished. But she carried a fierce, quiet determination. Late one evening, she reopened the digital files, scrolling through the genetic data like an archaeologist brushing dust off a buried relic. She refused to believe that 36 years of silence was the final word. She requested that the family's DNA be uploaded into a newly accessible genealogical network, one that specialized in distant familial links, one that could trace shared ancestry down to the fourth or fifth cousin. "Let's give the bloodline another chance to speak," she told her supervisor. And then, in August of 2025, something changed. It began with a routine alert. Potential close match found. 99.98% probability of kinship to Morrison family group. The name was redacted for privacy, but the location was unmistakable. California. At first, Bennett thought it was a clerical error. She double-checked the entry, compared the data, and reran the match through 2 independent systems. Each came back the same. The odds were impossible to ignore. The match belonged to a woman in her mid-30s, born under a different name, raised in California, never reported missing. The genetic signature lined up almost perfectly with what would be expected of one of Rachel's daughters. Bennett sat back in her chair, the hum of the office fading around her. The air felt suddenly heavy, electric. She had spent years looking at photos of those 2 missing babies, chubby faces frozen in black and white. And now there was a very real possibility that one of them was alive. Somewhere out there, completely unaware of who she truly was. Still, investigators knew better than to trust hope too quickly. False matches happened. Coincidences existed. Science could be precise, but human stories were messy. Bennett reached out to the lab for confirmation, requesting a deeper test, a full comparative genome analysis between the woman's sample and the preserved DNA of Rachel Morrison. It took 3 weeks, 3 long, impossible weeks. When the final report arrived, the conclusion was clear. Subject shares 50.1% genomic similarity with Rachel Morrison, consistent with a direct mother-daughter relationship. There it was. Undeniable. But the surprise didn't end there. As Bennett traced the woman's family records, she found a note, an adoption file. The woman had been taken in as an infant through foster care in late 1989. The paperwork listed her as found abandoned at a public location. No biological family recorded. No connection to Arizona. And then came the second revelation. In the same household where the woman had grown up, the records listed another adopted child, one just a year younger, adopted at the same time from the same Protective Services office. Bennett's hands went still on the keyboard. Another child. Another girl. The adoption agency had noted that they were believed to be siblings, but had no documentation to confirm it. Now, through the DNA comparison, the truth was emerging. The 2 women shared an unusually rare mitochondrial marker, identical to the one carried by Rachel Morrison. The probability of coincidence was less than 1 in a billion. For the first time in 36 years, the data spoke louder than the silence. When Bennett called the Mojave County office to report her findings, her voice shook slightly. "We may have located them," she said. "Both of them." There was a pause on the line. Then the chief investigator asked the question that everyone was thinking, the one that no one dared to say aloud for decades. "Are you telling me the Morrison girls are alive?" Bennett hesitated. "I'm saying the blood says they could be." The team moved cautiously. Before contacting the women, they needed confirmation from multiple labs, legal approval, coordination with child welfare authorities who held the old records. The process stretched on for weeks, each step bringing both excitement and dread. Dorothy, now in her late 80s, knew nothing yet. She spent her evenings by the window, the same light glowing softly on the porch. She had stopped asking questions, stopped chasing the years. But that August, she began dreaming of her daughter again. In one dream, she saw Rachel standing in the desert, holding two small girls by the hand. "Come home," Dorothy whispered in her sleep. "It's safe now?" In the investigation room, Bennett stared at the twin profiles glowing on her computer screen. Two women, one named Emily, one named Hannah, both living quiet, ordinary lives somewhere in California. Two names built on new beginnings, two stories that had unknowingly grown from the ashes of one that had never ended. The data was clear. The science unflinching. The daughters of Rachel Morrison had not vanished. They had simply lived another life. But the moment was bittersweet. For every miracle in forensic work, there was always a cost. Bennett knew what the next step would mean. Reopening wounds that had just begun to scar. Telling two grown women that the story of their lives was built on the foundation of a loss they never knew. Still, she couldn't deny what the evidence whispered through the decades. They were never gone. They were just waiting to be found. And so, in a small office filled with old files and quiet hums of machinery, the case that had begun in 1989 stirred once more. A mother's blood had spoken across 36 years, and the world was finally ready to listen. The report was printed, signed, sealed for official release. In the upper right corner, next to the case number, Detective Bennett wrote 3 words in her own hand before placing it on the captain's desk. "They are found." When the confirmation arrived, it came quietly. No sirens, no breaking news, no grand announcement, just a call on a calm autumn morning in 2025. When the air in Oxnard felt lighter than usual. Detective Bennett stood outside the Morrison home with a folder pressed to her chest, her breath steadying before she knocked. Inside, the same smell of old wood and candle wax lingered. Unchanged by the years, Dorothy's niece, Karen, answered the door. The old woman herself was resting in the armchair by the window, a blanket over her knees, the soft orange glow of the porch light spilling through the curtains behind her. The detective spoke gently. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. I wanted to tell you in person." Karen led her inside. The air carried the hush of reverence, as if time itself were holding its breath. Bennett sat across from Dorothy, her voice low and careful. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, "we've completed the tests. We have confirmation." The old woman opened her eyes, cloudy but bright. "Confirmation?" Bennett nodded. "Your granddaughters, Sophie and Claire, they're alive." For a moment the room stopped. The ticking clock on the wall seemed to lose its rhythm. Dorothy blinked, as if the words had come from another language, one she hadn't spoken in decades. "Alive," she whispered. The detective smiled softly. "Yes, ma'am. They're alive, both of them. They were adopted as infants, not far from here. They grew up safe, together, in a family that loved them. They didn't know who they were until now." Karen's hand went to her mouth. Dorothy didn't speak. Her fingers simply began to tremble. Bennett reached into her folder and pulled out 2 photographs. She hesitated before passing them across the table. The weight of 36 years resting on that single motion. 2 faces looked up from the glossy paper. Women in their 30s, smiling shyly, their eyes unmistakable. Dorothy's breath caught. The same soft curve of the cheeks, the same slope of the nose, the same spark in the eyes, the ghost of Rachel's face, split into 2 living reflections. Her voice broke on a whisper. "Oh my God, they're her!" Karen reached over, steadying her. "They have her smile." Bennett nodded. "We can arrange for a meeting if you'd like. There's no pressure. It'll happen when everyone's ready." But Dorothy didn't need time. "I've been ready for 36 years, she said. The reunion took place a few weeks later. There were no cameras, No reporters. Just a quiet afternoon in late October, when the sun hung low and gold across the street. The same porch light was on, as it had been every evening since 1989. Dorothy insisted it stay lit, even in the daylight. "They should see it," she said. "It will guide them home." A car pulled up slowly at the curb. Two women stepped out. For a heartbeat, Dorothy couldn't move. She saw them through the window and pressed her hand to her chest. Emily was taller, her hair tied back, a nervous half-smile trembling on her lips. Hannah stood beside her, smaller, her hand clutching her sister's like a child's. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. When the door opened, time folded in on itself. Dorothy rose from her chair with a strength that surprised everyone. Her legs shook. But she walked across the room and stopped in front of them. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. 3 generations, stitched back together by blood and memory. Emily was the first to break. She stepped forward and fell into Dorothy's arms. The sound that escaped the old woman's throat was somewhere between a sob and a prayer. Hannah followed, wrapping her arms around them both. It was not graceful or composed. It was raw, trembling, full of the ache of years. There were no rehearsed words, no introductions, only the pulse of reunion, the small gasps of disbelief, the whispers of names once lost to silence. After a while, they sat together in the living room. The house seemed to breathe again. Emily's eyes wandered to the photographs on the wall, pictures of a younger woman holding 2 babies. "That's her," she said softly. "That's Mom." Dorothy nodded, tears streaming unchecked. "Yes," she said. "That's your mother. She loved you so much. She tried to bring you home." The sisters listened as the family told them pieces of the story, the day they left, the years of searching, the candles, the birthdays that were never forgotten. For every answer, there were 100 new questions, but no one cared. The questions could wait. The only thing that mattered was that they were here. Flesh and bone, breathing the same air their mother once did. As evening fell, Karen lit 2 small candles on the table. The sisters watched in silence as Dorothy struck the match. Her hands shook, but her voice was clear. "Every year I made you a cake," she said. "Every year I prayed you'd come home to blow out the candles. I guess this will have to do." Emily reached for her hand. "We're home now," she said. Dorothy closed her eyes, and for the first time in 36 years, she let herself believe it. The weeks that followed were filled with stories. Old photographs spread across the kitchen table. Letters Rachel had written before she disappeared. Videos of birthdays that had been celebrated in silence. Emily and Hannah learned about the mother they never knew. A woman who had loved them fiercely, who had fought to give them a better life, even if it cost her everything. They learned about the family that had never stopped searching, the red pins on the map, the flyers that curled in the heat, the porch light that burned through decades of darkness. And slowly, they began to understand the magnitude of what had been lost and what had been found. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Emily stood by the window, looking out at the street where her mother had driven away all those years ago. "Do you think she knew?" she asked quietly. "That we'd find our way back?" Dorothy joined her at the window, her hand resting gently on her granddaughter's shoulder. "I think she hoped," she said. "And sometimes hope is all we need to keep the light on." In the months that followed, the story began to spread, not as a headline, but as a whisper, a story shared in classrooms, police briefings, conferences across the country. Investigators spoke of it as a turning point. Proof. that no disappearance should ever be declared final until the blood itself has spoken. There is no such thing as a closed case, one lecturer said, only silent evidence waiting to be heard. Forensic programs used the Morrison file as an example of how technology and human faith could walk side by side. DNA, they said, might provide the answer. But it was the persistence of a grandmother's love that kept the light burning long enough for science to find its way. Emily and Hannah began speaking publicly about their story. They joined foundations that help families of missing children, visiting schools and shelters, telling others to hold on, to believe that silence does not always mean the end. We were found because someone never stopped looking, Emily would say. Someone left the light on. For Dorothy, those words were enough. She passed quietly a few years later, her favorite chair still facing the window. On her nightstand, the porch light bulb lay wrapped in a small cloth, a keepsake from the lamp that had burned through 36 years of waiting. The family buried it beside her, a symbol of the faith that refused to fade. And though her body rested in the earth, her spirit remained in the stories, in the light that still glows softly on the porch, in the two women who carry her daughter's smile into the world. Now, when dawn breaks over Oxnard, the old house still stands, worn by time, but gentle in the morning sun. The porch light glows faintly, even against the brightness of day, a small, steady flame that outlived the dark. Inside, the map of red pins has been carefully folded and placed in a frame. A museum piece now, a reminder of the journey that brought them home. And in the living room, new photographs hang beside the old. 3 generations together. Smiling. Whole. The story of Rachel Morrison and her daughters is no longer a mystery. It is a testament to the mothers who wait, to the detectives who refuse to give up, to the scientists who listen to the whispers in the blood, and to the light that burns in the window, calling the lost home, even when the world has forgotten their names. Because some stories don't end. They just wait for the right moment to be told. And this story, after 36 years of silence, finally found its voice. In the DNA that connected mother to daughters, in the porch light that never went dark, in the hope that refused to die. Rachel Morrison drove away one summer morning in 1989. And though she never made it home, her daughters did. Guided by the love of a grandmother who believed that no night lasts forever, and that every light, no matter how small, has the power to pierce the dark. If this story moved you, if you believe like the Morrison family did that no truth ever really disappears, then you're part of something bigger. You're part of a community that refuses to let the forgotten stay forgotten. A community that knows every missing person has a story. And every story deserves to be heard. Because somewhere out there, another family is waiting. Another porch light is burning. And another truth is hiding in the silence, waiting for someone like you to help bring it home. Our community doesn't just watch these stories. We carry them forward. We share them with others who need to know that hope is real, that science and love can work miracles together, that even after decades of darkness, the light can still find its way through. So if you're with us, if you believe in the power of never giving up, stay here. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell. Because every time you do, you're keeping another light on. You're helping another family hold on just a little bit longer. And before you go, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from right now? What brought you to this story? Have you ever known someone who disappeared? Or maybe you're here because you believe in the power of truth. Whatever your reason, drop a comment below. Tell us your story. Because our community is built on shared hope, on the belief that no one should ever be forgotten, and that together we can make sure every missing person finds their way home. This is more than just a channel. It's a movement, a promise that will keep telling these stories until every last one is solved, until every family gets the answer they deserve, until every porch light can finally be turned off, not because hope is lost, but because everyone has come home. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for keeping the light on with us. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, hold on to hope, hold on to each other, and never stop believing that the truth is out there, waiting to be found.